Okay, welcome to the Progressive Bible Study. We are looking at the Beatitudes in Matthew's Gospel today. That is Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. I will start in about 40 seconds or so. And a reminder for those of you who tune in, um, please do feel free to ask a question in the chat window or make a comment, and I will reserve some time at the end to interact with the things you ask and the things you say. Okay, I'm going to start, and I'm going to begin with the first P, which is prayer. And the prayer I want to share with you comes from this book. It's called Celtic Daily Prayer. This is actually the second in a series of Celtic Daily Prayer books. And this is a prayer about the potential that God has given us. For the potential you see in us and the possibilities that lie ahead, Christ be before us. For our plans and their fulfillment, for your promises and their unfolding, Christ be before us. In the problems that beset us and the perils that ensnare us, Christ be within us. Be around us, above us, and beneath us. On your path, God, and not our own. Be all our journeying. Rule our hearts, that they may be yours. Amen. Okay, the second P is perspective. And what I want to do today is a little bit of review for those of you who have tuned into these Bible studies, whether live or have gone back and watched them at a more convenient time. And what I want to do today is give a kind of summary of how we can view biblical literature, and then also a summary of the ancient culture under a series of categories, because they are relevant for today's text that we're looking at, which again is the first part of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. It's the Beatitudes, chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. We'll get into that in just a second. So one scholar, he's a New Testament scholar, his name is Luke Timothy Johnson. He has produced an introduction to the New Testament text, which is succinct and very useful. And one of the things that he does in that text is to outline 4 dimensions that are good to keep in mind when approaching biblical literature. So the first dimension that he draws attention to is what he calls the anthropological dimension, which is to say that we recognize when we're reading books of the Bible that we're reading books produced by human beings in a particular time and place, particular cultures that are ancient. And in some cases, we're dealing with super ancient cultures, some 5,000 years ago, or at least preserving traditions that are that old, and sometimes, in a few cases, even a little older than that. So there is a fundamental difference between how the Old Testament was compiled and how the New Testament was compiled. There are parallels, but the Old Testament took several hundred years to come together, whereas the New Testament more or less came together in about 100 years. So there is a bit of a difference there in terms of the influences of culture on these writers. So the first thing to keep in mind, first of these 4 dimensions, according to Luke Timothy Johnson, is the anthropological dimension, to recognize that we are reading writings, ancient writings written by ancient human beings. Second dimension to keep in mind, says Luke Timothy Johnson, is the historical dimension. And this is sort of related to the anthropological, but it focuses more on the fact that each one of these texts is produced at a specific time, in a specific place, written to specific people in the ancient world who lived in history. So that's the historical dimension of things. And again, when we're thinking about the two testaments, the Old Testament came together over a much longer period of time. So we're dealing with even more cultural influences from a wider spread of time than we are when we're looking at the New Testament, which is a much more condensed time period. Although in that condensed time period, we do have a lot of political changes going on, certainly in the first century and the early second century in the Jewish world. Um, but that period of about 100 years when the New Testament came together is heavily influenced in history by the Roman context and even more narrowly the Greek cultural context. So that's the historical dimension. Another dimension to keep in mind when reading the Bible, according to Luke Timothy Johnson, is the literary dimension. So that's to see each one of these texts in the Bible, each one of these books, as a piece of literature. So you don't just approach a biblical book when you're reading it with the anthropological dimension in mind. It's important to keep that in mind to recognize that we're dealing with real human beings who wrote these texts. And we don't just have the historical dimension in mind, recognizing that these writers operated in history, specific times, places, writing to specific audiences who also lived in history. We also keep in mind that these biblical books contribute to literature, classical literature in our world. And each one of them, as pieces of literature, has a lot of similarities with other ancient pieces of literature from a long time ago. So the literary element. And then the final dimension is perhaps the most obvious, which is the religious dimension. So keeping in mind that these texts have a devotional quality to them, we use them as objects of religious devotion. We use them to instruct us when it comes to matters of faith and practice, and also to draw spiritual nourishment from them. In addition to the sort of institutional concept, which is that we read these texts, these biblical texts, every single Sunday as part of the institution of worship. So the anthropological, the historical, literary, and the religious, four dimensions to keep in mind when reading the Bible. But then another thing that Luke Timothy Johnson does, and he's again dealing specifically with the New Testament context, is that he probes the cultural context around the writing of the New Testament. And he identifies 6 categories that are important to keep in mind when we're thinking about the Greco-Roman culture of the first century and the early second century, the period of time when the New Testament was written and compiled. So the first cultural piece to keep in mind is that the Greco-Roman world was heavily patriarchal. So the Latin phrase that's used to describe the head of the household, the father figure, is paterfamilias. He's a bit like the family emperor. So his local household is sort of a microcosm of the empire writ large. And at the top, the pinnacle of the empire was the emperor himself. He is the father of the fatherland. That's how the Romans referred to him. So the entire empire, in a way, is thought of as this giant family. And then on the microscopic scale is the local family, where the father figure ruled with authority because it was a patriarchal context. And we see this kind of culture seeping into various places in the New Testament, in First Peter, in Ephesians, and in Colossians. There are sections of those letters that are sometimes referred to as household codes. And household codes, as the name implies, were prescriptions for how to govern the household. Wives, be submissive to husbands, children, be submissive to parents, slaves, obey your masters. And at the top of that little hierarchy, of course, is the father figure. So that's a heavily patriarchal understanding of the family that reflects the culture at the time. Things have changed, of course, over time. Most of us see the family unit as much more teamwork based between partners than patriarchal. Another thing to keep in mind, and we've talked about this over the past few weeks, is the notion of honor shame. So I've talked about ascribed honor and acquired honor. So ascribed honor being something that you inherit as um, part of your birth. So born into an aristocratic family, you are ascribed honor. And the genealogies in the Gospels are attempts by gospel writers to ascribe honor to Jesus by tracing his lineage back to illustrious figures from Israelite past. Acquired honor is a little bit different. It's something that you earn. So you could earn this in a foot race in the Olympics or in a boxing match that you win. You could earn it by gaining education or by linking yourself with a particular group that had honor. So you could acquire honor. And throughout the Gospels and the New Testament more broadly, you have various references to honor because it was such an important cultural concept in the ancient Greco Roman world. So we have talked over the past few weeks about these various honor challenges that Jesus faced when he was engaged with religious leaders in all kinds of conversations and sometimes even outright arguments. They were challenging his honor, his right to speak in public with authority, or the authority that he seemed to claim. And then there are various places in the New Testament letters that elevate honor. So one of my favorite is Romans chapter 12, where Paul says, outdo one another in showing honor to each other. So he's taking that cultural concept and he's using it to try to build an ethic for church life. And there are over 30 references, almost 36 references in the New Testament to this notion of honor. And on the other end of the scale, the shame scale, you had categories like prostitutes and innkeepers and sailors and tax collectors and fishermen. And so it's helpful to understand this honor shame culture when reading the Gospels because we realize the people that Jesus associated himself with were at the bottom of the honor scale. So patriarchal culture and honor shame culture. And then number 3 is this notion of patronage. So the entire superstructure of Roman culture was built on patron-client relationships, and the chief patron of them all was the emperor himself. And then, each person underneath him, they were clients of his. So he was the patron of, say, the senators. So he would do favors for them. They would shower him with honor. And then all the way down the scale, those senators were patrons of clients a little lower down on the scale. The senators would, do favors for those people a little lower on the scale, and they in turn would show those senators honor. And on it goes all the way down the whole system. We can see this notion of patronage in the New Testament. So one place is with reference to Jesus in the book of Acts, Acts chapter 10, where Luke, who's the writer of Acts, says, Jesus went about doing good. Now, the word that Luke uses there that gets translated as doing good is actually a word that comes from this patron-client culture. It's a patronage word. So Jesus is like this benefactor, this patron who's dispensing good deeds and doing good work. In Romans chapter 16, Paul talks about his own personal benefactor, his patron. Her name was Phoebe, and she was a woman of means and had been supporting Paul's ministry financially. So patron-client relationships can even be found in the New Testament. Another feature of ancient culture is polytheism. So you have the Roman pantheon of gods and the Greek pantheon of gods. And the Romans tended to take those Greek gods and just give them Roman names. But this is part of the cultural environment, a big part of the cultural environment in the ancient world, so much so that even local households could have patron deities, specific gods that family or that local group showed honor to. And of course, the New Testament refers to polytheism in a negative way in multiple places, one of which is Romans chapter 1, where Paul denigrates those who turn God into images, birds or other animals or whatever. And they're inheriting that from the larger Jewish culture, which was fiercely monotheistic and opposed to this notion of polytheism. Another important cultural concept to keep in mind is the fact that all the New Testament writings, all the key figures in early Christianity, were born, they were raised in, they were lived as Christians in, and they died in the Roman Empire. And this was the dominant force in the first century, in the early second century when the New Testament was written. And it was the dominant force all the way until the early fifth century, the year 410, when the Visigoths under King Alaric sacked the city of Rome. And in between there, in the fourth century, the empire itself became Christianized. So when we talk about the crucifixion of Christ, it's good to keep in mind this larger Roman imperial context, because crucifixion was a political instrument of terror that the Romans would use to keep people under their thumbs. And then there are other places in the New Testament that make explicit some concepts that get drawn out of the imperial context. So, for example, the writer of Colossians in Colossians chapter 2 talks about leading people in triumph. So that word triumph is actually drawn from a Roman military context, because when the Romans were victorious in a particular region, they would then have this triumph, this march through the city of Rome to honor, again, that notion of honor, to honor the conquering general. And then ultimately that general would pay his homage to the emperor, who was the one to receive the chief honor for that mission of conquest. So even these themes are reflecting the larger imperial context. And the final thing that Luke Timothy Johnson points to when talking about the larger cultural context of the New Testament is the fact that all of the earliest Christians were Jews. Jesus himself was a Jew. So Judaism heavily influenced the imagery that we find in the New Testament, so much so that Jesus' death on the cross is referred to as a sacrifice, which is a concept that's drawn straight from the sacrificial system in the Jerusalem temple. Not just there were also sacrifices that happened in Greco-Roman local religious groups. But when we're talking about the connection between sacrifice and forgiveness that goes with the crucifixion of Christ, that's a concept, or those two concepts are drawn straight from the temple sacrifices. So today's text comes from Matthew chapter 5. It's the Beatitudes. And all of these things, when we're talking about the cultural context, are important when thinking about the Beatitudes, because the Beatitudes themselves, not just because of the speaker, but because of some of the themes and even the notion of beatitude, it's drawn heavily from the Jewish context. Again, Jesus himself, a Jew. But then there's this other countercultural aspect to these Beatitudes. They seem to take this larger cultural context and flip it on its head, because the Roman Empire celebrated power and honor. And Jesus in the Beatitudes talks about the merciful and the meek. It seems to take this larger cultural context and flip it on its head. So that brings us to pieces of scripture. And again, we're looking at Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. And it is the Beatitudes. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up the mountain. And after he sat down, his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Okay, so this coming Sunday is All Saints Sunday, and the lectionary cycle is on a 3-year cycle, years A, B, and C, and 2 of those 3 years, the gospel reading for All Saints Sunday is the Beatitudes. So this is year A, so we're reading Matthew's version of the Beatitudes. Year B, the All Saints Sunday reading is from John chapter 11. It's the raising of Lazarus from the dead. But then in year C, we return to the Beatitudes in the Gospel of Luke. So Luke's version of the Beatitudes. So the Beatitudes are 2 of the 3 lectionary cycle years. They're read on All Saints Sunday. And one of the reasons why, at least with respect to Matthew's version, is because of this phrase, blessed are those who mourn. So one of the things that we do on All Saints Sunday is to remember the saints, those who've passed away over the course of the previous year. And we're blessing those who are mourning their memory. So that's one of the reasons why we read this great text on All Saints Sunday. Now, it's important to set the literary context of these famous verses. So one of the ways to think about Matthew's gospel is to think about it as the quote unquote most Jewish of the 4 gospels, which is a bit of a misnomer because they're all heavily influenced by Judaism. But the thing that makes Matthew's gospel different is how intentional he seems to be in recreating, in a way, some of the key stories from Israelite past, recreating them so that Jesus himself lives them. And then, of course, in Matthew's gospel, Jesus, when he teaches, highlights the importance of the Jewish law. So if we were to go all the way back to the beginning of Matthew's gospel, one of the indicators that Matthew is heavily influenced by both the Old Testament and by this broader Jewish context, Matthew himself almost certainly was both an ethnic Jew and a practicing Jew, and he was almost certainly writing to an audience that was comprised themselves of ethnic and practicing Jews. The first verse of Matthew's gospel begins with something that will sound familiar to those of you who know what the first book of the Bible is. So Matthew's gospel begins with this phrase: "This is the book of Genesis of Jesus, the Messiah, son of David, son of Abraham." This is the book of Genesis of Jesus. So in a way, Matthew is trying to recapitulate or retell with new language the story of Scripture, beginning with Genesis, in the beginning. So that's actually a way to translate that Greek phrase, the book of Genesis of Jesus. So in a way, Jesus is a new Genesis figure. Now, this is the first of what will be a series of things that Matthew does to closely tie the story of Jesus to the story of Israel earlier in biblical history. Now, that first phrase right out of the gates in Matthew chapter 1, the first verse, we're given several indicators that Matthew is very closely tying Jesus to his Jewish heritage. So the book of Genesis, that's one, of Jesus, the Messiah, that's another, son of David, that's a kingly phrase, that's another close connection with Jewish history or Israelite history, and then son of Abraham, which connects Jesus to the first patriarch in the book of Genesis. Then the next thing that Matthew does, right after he introduces Jesus in this way and talks about this book of Genesis of Jesus, is that Matthew traces a genealogy. And this goes back to what I was saying a bit ago about honor. So this is ascribed honor. This is honor that Jesus is given merely by means of the fact that he was born into this ancient lineage that goes all the way back to, says Matthew, Abraham. So the lineage, the genealogy of Jesus is connected with this patriarch from the past. Another thing that Matthew does throughout his gospel, and he does this more so than the other gospel writers, is he uses this phrase, "in order to fulfill," brackets, scripture. So what he'll do is he'll tell a portion of the story, and then he'll say this happened in order to fulfill, and then he'll cite some passage from the Old Testament or from the Hebrew Bible. He does this more than a dozen times. That exact phrase, this happened in order to fulfill, more than a dozen times in this gospel to closely connect this story that he's telling about Jesus to Jewish past. And then something interesting that's easily missed when reading the story of Jesus in Matthew's gospel is how Matthew presents Jesus in a way as a personification of Israel. So when Jesus is an infant, and this is Matthew's gospel is the only gospel that does this, we have stories of Jesus fleeing to and from Egypt. Well, that sounds an awful lot like the Exodus in the book of Exodus. And then Matthew, more than the other gospel writers, really emphasizes the place of Jesus' baptism. He passed through these waters of the Jordan at his baptism, very similar to Israel passing through the waters of the Jordan to enter the promised land. Matthew's Jesus endures temptation in the wilderness, which recalls the 40 years of wilderness wandering of the Israelites. And then another thing that Matthew does, which is very interesting, is that he, in effect, breaks up huge chunks of Jesus' speeches into 5 categories. And after each speech concludes, Matthew uses the same phrase. The phrase that he concludes the speech with is, when Jesus had finished speaking. It's almost identical in Greek every time that he uses it. 5 times he does this. So you have the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 through 7, which ends at the end of chapter 7 with, when Jesus finished speaking. That exact phrase. Then in chapters 10 and 11, when Jesus is speaking about missionaries, that section ends, just chapter 10, sorry. That section ends at the beginning of chapter 11 verse 1, when Jesus finished speaking. Same phrase. Chapter 13, Jesus is teaching in parables. Chapter 13 ends when Jesus finished speaking. Chapter 18, there are a series of discourses by Jesus about the church or life in the church. The beginning of chapter 19 verse 1, it says, when Jesus finished speaking, same phrase. And then in chapters 24 and 25, there are what's called the apocalyptic discourses of Jesus that include a whole bunch of parables in chapter 25. That section ends in chapter 26, verse 1, with when Jesus finished speaking. 5 speeches. So what scholars have done is connected those 5 speeches to the first 5 books of the Bible, the books of Moses, and said that what Matthew is trying to do is liken Jesus to a Moses figure. Now that is even more explicit when we look at the first verse of today's text, which talks about Jesus ascending the mountain in order to deliver his version of the law, or his interpretation of Jewish law. Well, Moses ascended Mount Sinai in Exodus chapter 19 when he received the law from God and then delivered it to the people. So you have all these very interesting nuances in Matthew's gospel that connect Jesus very closely to Israelite past and to biblical history more broadly. So it seems pretty clear, and there are lots of other examples that we could point to. It seems pretty clear, though, that Matthew is a Jewish writer writing to a Jewish audience. An audience, all of them, the writer and the audience, they're followers of Jesus, but they're Jews. They're practicing Jews, and for them, seeing Jesus so closely connected to their ancient heritage would have been incredibly meaningful. So now back into our text, the Beatitudes. Again, the first verse, Jesus went up the mountain. And again, that's just like Moses in the book of Exodus, Exodus 19, ascending Mount Sinai to receive and then deliver the law to the people. Well, Jesus does something similar here. He ascends this mountain and he delivers his version or his interpretation of Jewish law. Another thing that happens right away at the beginning of today's text is that Jesus sat down to teach. That's what Matthew says. He sat down. Well, Jewish leaders didn't stand to teach. Sitting down was a form of authority. When you sat down, then people would pay attention to you and listen to your teaching. So Matthew is presenting Jesus as a kind of rabbi here who sits down in order to teach. And the Beatitudes themselves have close connections not so much in their linguistic form, but in the fact that they begin with the phrase or the word blessed. They have close connection with several places in the Old Testament. It uses the same kind of phraseology. So the first psalm in the book of Psalms, happy or blessed are those who do not follow the advice of the wicked, or sit in the seat of scoffers, but their delight is in the way of God. Blessed are they, happy are they. It's a beatitude, right in the first part of the first psalm in the Old Testament. There's a passage in Proverbs chapter 3 in the Old Testament that says, happy are those who find wisdom. Blessed are those who find wisdom, and those who get understanding. It's a beatitude. And then a little later in the book of Proverbs chapter 20, the writer says, the righteous walk in integrity. Happy are those who follow them, or blessed are they who follow them. So that's another beatitude. So there are different ways to translate, both in Hebrew and in Greek, this word that English often translates as blessed or happy. So yeah, you could translate it as blessed or happy. We can also translate it as fortunate or lucky. One translation begins each one of the Beatitudes in Matthew 5 with congratulations and then an exclamation point. So now the question becomes, when you start digging into these Beatitudes, how is it blessed, or how are you fortunate or lucky? Why should congratulations be in order to those who are persecuted or who are reviled or those who are mourning? How is that something that makes sense? Like, why would you bless people who are in mourning? Why would you say they're lucky or fortunate? Why would you bless or say fortunate are you when you're abused and reviled? How does that work exactly? And then, of course, Matthew's version says, blessed are you who are poor in spirit. Luke's version just cuts off the in spirit part and says, blessed are the poor. And one of my advisors at Harvard, his name was Helmut Kuster. He was a famous New Testament scholar. He used to smirk in class saying, it's no blessing to be poor. So what's going on here? Likewise, it's no blessing to be poor in spirit, which seems to take material circumstances of poverty and then internalize them so that it's weighing on your soul. The poor in spirit. It's not just material, but also spiritual, emotional, physical. It reminds me of something that Tevye says, the protagonist in Fiddler on the Roof. Some of you who've listened to me preach on the Beatitudes in the past know that I like to cite this. So Tevye in Fiddler on the Roof says, oh, dear Lord, it's no shame to be poor, but it's no great honor either. And then later, when Tevye is told that money is the world's curse, he replies, if money is the world's curse, then may the Lord smite me with it, and may I never recover. So again, how does Jesus say, blessed are the poor in spirit, or blessed are you who are poor? How is it a blessing to be poor? How is it a blessing to mourn? How is it a blessing to be persecuted? Now, what some scholars have done to try to explain this, because it doesn't really make sense just on the surface of it, what some scholars have done is to say, well, what Jesus is doing here is, there's a technical term, he's doing something eschatological, which is a fancy way of saying he's dealing with the last things or the end times or things that are going to happen in the future, sometime from now, at the end or the last, coming from the Greek word that means end or last. So eschatological. So what they're saying is that each one of these Beatitudes is not saying it's a blessing now to mourn. It's saying it's a blessing now to mourn only in the sense that in the future, you're going to be comforted. Or blessed are you who are poor in spirit now, but in the future, you will inherit the kingdom of heaven. And likewise for the rest. So that's one way scholars have tried to deal with these Beatitudes, to say, well, they're eschatological. Jesus is pronouncing a blessing in the immediate sense, but it doesn't take effect until sometime in the future when God institutes this role reversal, and those who are persecuted now are going to find blessing in the future, or those who are merciful now will find blessing in the future. So the whole thing is future oriented. That's possible. There are problems, I think, with just saying these beatitudes are future oriented. On the one hand, it's comforting, I think, for people to phrase them this way or to frame them this way, to think, okay, sure, I might suffer now, but in the future, I might receive a blessing. And certainly the Greek grammar seems to lend itself to this kind of interpretation, because each one of the second parts of the Beatitudes is in the future. So they will inherit the earth. They will be filled. They will receive mercy. It's all future oriented. So in one sense, those scholars are not completely out in left field that say this is all eschatological, because there is this future orientation to some of these beatitudes. The question becomes, and this is where the problem is, what about now? Are you just suffering now in order to get some future blessing? Is there no blessing for you now? And it reminds me of something that Karl Marx would say about religion, that it's the opiate of the masses. What he was getting at there is sometimes religion can be so future oriented about heavenly bliss, et cetera, that it basically constrains people in the present. So they're just gonna succumb. They're just gonna submit to their current material oppression without thinking of changing their current situation, because they have this opiate about the future, that the future is where my blessing is going to be, and I can just sort of muscle through right now because the future is where my blessing is. And I think that's a valid critique. Is there no blessing for the people who are listed in the Beatitudes? No blessing now? So what are we to make of these? So the Beatitudes, they're about blessing things and people that typically don't get blessed. And certainly when you pair up these Beatitudes alongside what I was saying earlier about Roman culture, the Beatitudes seem like a role reversal, to say the least, a complete twisting around of the things that seem like they are valued in Roman culture. Jesus is emphasizing other things. Instead of war and empire, it's peacemaking. Instead of ruthlessness, it's mercy, and on it goes. So each one of these, the poor in spirit, those who mourn, that is, those who are grieving, the meek, the humble, those who hunger and thirst for justice, they're blessed. The merciful are blessed. The pure in heart, those who have this kind of innocent honesty about them, this genuineness, this authenticity, the pure in heart. And then the peacemakers, those who actively are at work now in the midst of conflict and violence in order to bring about peace. And I think of the great Desmond Tutu, who put his body on the line in the midst of apartheid in order to bring peace. He's a peacemaker. And then those who are arrested and persecuted for advocating for justice, like Jesus himself at the end of his life. And on it goes. Jesus blesses all of them. And there are, of course, individuals in each one of these categories, but he's blessing a category also, those who are merciful, those who are peacemakers. And I would say that he's not so much making declarative statements here. He isn't saying that to be poor in spirit is to be blessed, or to be grieving the loss of a loved one is to be blessed, or to be persecuted is to be blessed. He's not making declarative statements. He's not saying these folks are lucky or fortunate for their current state in life. So they're not so much declarative. I would say the Beatitudes are actually performative. That is, they confer a blessing in the mere act of speaking them. So they're not declarative in the sense of saying these categories are blessed. It's more conferring the blessing by speaking the blessing. So to say the poor in spirit are blessed is not to say that you're fortunate to be spiritually impoverished. It's rather a way of saying you who are spiritually impoverished need to know that you also are blessed. You're not left out. Or to say those who mourn are blessed is not to say that you're fortunate to be grieving. No, it's rather a way of saying you who are enduring grief, those who mourn, need to know that you also are blessed. You're not left out. So the Beatitudes are a way of embracing those people who can so easily be neglected or ignored. So Jesus is paying attention to those who can so easily be skipped over or brushed to the side. So the pronouncement of a beatitude is to confer a blessing upon these folks. And this reminds me of something, and I want to close with this, that Reverend Nadia Bolz-Weber wrote in her book, Accidental Saints, where she wrote, the Beatitudes are all about Jesus's lavish blessing of the people the world doesn't have much time for. People in pain, people who work for peace instead of profit, people who exercise mercy instead of vengeance. Maybe Jesus, she writes, was simply blessing the ones around him who didn't otherwise receive blessing, who had come to believe that for them, blessing would never be in the cards. So I think if we consider the Beatitudes from that perspective, that the mere speaking of the blessing confers the blessing, I think it's significant that the first major lesson that Jesus teaches in these 5 speeches that Matthew outlines in the gospel, the first speech, the first part of that first speech, is conferring blessing on people who are ignored. And isn't that how Jesus conducted himself through the rest of his ministry, blessing those who didn't feel like they deserved a blessing? Okay, I want to save a few minutes here. If you have any questions or comments that you'd like to make, now's the time. I will interact in real time with you. Yes, no? One thing I will say, I think it's significant that these Beatitudes are read on All Saints Sunday. Again, because in the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are those who mourn is such a powerful statement. And again, if speaking a beatitude confers the blessing, then we are conferring blessings on Sunday to those who are grieving, to those who are mourning. And just by virtue of reading the names of those who passed away, we are remembering that there are people in our midst who are grieving. So we're not forgetting them. We're doing the spirit of what Jesus does when he speaks these Beatitudes, and that is to bring people who are on the fringes or who can so easily be ignored. We're bringing them in and paying attention to them, loving, gracious attention. Yes, I'm seeing one comment here. The Beatitudes are troubling. The second part of each Beatitude doesn't seem to hold with the blessing for me. Yeah. The language in these is difficult, but it's full enough, I would say, to capture both this eschatological notion and also the immediate conferring of blessing. There is a future orientation to a lot of what Jesus does in the Gospels, what, again, scholars call eschatological, thinking about the future. So, to deny that is to miss a key point that Jesus does make in various places in the Gospels. If you turn to Matthew chapter 25, you see him talking about the future there. And what marks out a follower of Jesus, it's the person who pays attention to the least of these. And that recognition comes, at least in the way Jesus tells that story at the end of Matthew 25, it comes in the future. So it has a future orientation to it. Some scholars refer to the kingdom of God as already and not yet. So it's been inaugurated, it's now underway, and we're participating in it. But there's this future side of it as well, this sort of climactic side, and that's the visionary piece. That's the dream piece. That's why we can bring in these great visionary sequences from the book of Revelation and talk about the future. Um, it's a future that we want to live into, and it's always a big future that we see in the Gospels and also in the book of Revelation and in other places as well. So the Beatitudes, in a way, are participating in this big future that Jesus is trying to just sketch out for his followers, and we get to participate in making that and living into that future reality now. So that's the already and the not yet part. And yes, I see another one here. Blessed are those who find wisdom in these studies. Hopefully, it's easier for some than others, or maybe all. Okay, so, and you're welcome. Those of you who are thanking me in the chat window here. Yeah, so we're going to talk about the Beatitudes on Sunday, and I'm going to weave in some more Nadia Bolz-Weber because she has some really powerful things that she says about Beatitudes and how to actually do blessing now. And it's a good setup for us as we are all going to need a little special blessing this coming Tuesday. Okay, see you next week.